What would you do if your husband suddenly froze your bank cards and sent legal papers to your door? I thought I was in control after telling everyone his boss had crossed a line with me. But instead of defending me, my husband turned cold and started building a case. My name is Isolde Crane. I am 34 years old, and I work as a receptionist at a medical office where I deal with patients who complain about waiting times all day. I used to think my life was painfully ordinary until I convinced myself I deserved more than Daniel, my husband, could ever give me. Daniel is 37, steady and quiet, an accountant who spends evenings balancing numbers even after he gets home. We have been married for 9 years and have 2 children, Ethan, who is 8, and Clara, who is 5. From the outside, we looked like the typical family. House in the suburbs, good schools, decent jobs, weekend visits with grandparents. But inside, I felt trapped in routine. Daniel never fought for me, never showed passion. He just existed in the background. And I told myself that if I felt restless, it was because he had stopped being a real partner. That was how I justified the attention I accepted from Marcus Hale, his boss. Marcus is 45, charming, confident, the kind of man who enters a room and people notice, unlike Daniel, who could sit in a corner all night and no one would even remember he was there. Marcus made me feel seen. He leaned in during conversations and told me I had a spark Daniel ignored. When I finally told Daniel that Marcus had once tried me, I framed it as me being honest and vulnerable. But in truth, I knew it would put him in a corner. Either he would fight for me, or he would shrink further, and I was ready to use either outcome against him. What I did not expect was that instead of defending me publicly, Daniel went silent, and that silence made me look like the brave one while he seemed weak in front of everyone. My mother Linda said Daniel was cold, my friends said he was spineless, and even at family dinners, I made sure to remind people that a real husband should protect his wife from a man like Marcus. I believed I was winning the story, painting myself as the victim while turning Daniel into the villain. But now, as I sit here, remembering the moment my card was declined at the grocery store, I see that Daniel had been writing his own story quietly, behind my back, and his version had all the power. Daniel's silence after I told him about Marcus became my greatest weapon, because I could spin it however I wanted. I told people that he had no reaction because deep down he didn't care, that he let his boss disrespect me and did nothing about it. The truth was, he didn't argue, didn't defend Marcus, didn't defend me either. He just withdrew into himself, and that gave me room to narrate the story however I pleased. At home in the kitchen, when he sat with his spreadsheet spread out, I walked past and reminded him that a real man would have stood up to Marcus. He looked at me but said nothing, and I told myself that his silence meant guilt. Later, when my mother came over, I told her that I had confessed to Daniel how Marcus had once crossed a line with me, and that Daniel simply shrugged. She shook her head and told me I deserved someone who would protect me. That was exactly what I wanted people to think. By the weekend, I was repeating the story again, this time in front of my sister and her husband at the living room table. I said that I had been brave enough to admit what Marcus did, and that Daniel just stared at his shoes. My brother-in-law muttered that no husband should let another man cross a line with his wife, and I sat back feeling satisfied, because once again Daniel looked small in front of others. He never raised his voice to correct me. I could see him listening, but he stayed silent, and that only strengthened my performance. The children started to notice the tension too. Ethan asked me one night why Daddy was always working in the office after dinner. I told him that his father had chosen numbers over family, and that he didn't understand how to fight for the people he loved. Clara was too little to understand, but I still used her as a shield, pulling her onto my lap while I complained loudly in the kitchen about how Daniel had failed me. I made sure the children heard the words brave and victim because I wanted them on my side too. Looking back, I realize how careful Daniel was in those moments, taking his work into the study and closing the door, never rising to the bait. At the time, I thought it was weakness, but now I know it was calculation. When Daniel's brother Tom stopped by one evening to borrow a drill, I took the chance to complain to him too. I told him that Daniel was letting his boss humiliate me, that he had no spine to defend his wife. Tom gave me a sharp look and told me quietly that maybe I was stirring trouble. But I laughed and said Daniel could speak for himself if he disagreed. Daniel just stood there with his arms crossed, silent while I kept talking. My mother Linda, who had come by with a casserole, jumped in to defend me, saying Daniel had always been cold and I deserved better. The room felt divided, Tom glaring, Linda fussing over me, Daniel staring at the floor. I thought that was a victory, because I had turned his own family into witnesses of his so-called failure. The manipulation became almost automatic. If Daniel came home late, I told people he was hiding from me. If he tried to explain himself, I told everyone he was defensive because he knew he was wrong. I gaslighted him at every turn, saying that he should be thanking me for being honest instead of criticizing me for making a scene. In my mind, I was the one holding the marriage together, because at least I was being open about what Marcus had done, while Daniel was letting his pride ruin everything. I told my friends that most men would have left after hearing that story, but Daniel was too passive to even care. They nodded, and I basked in their sympathy, convinced I was untouchable. What I didn't notice was Daniel's quiet movements in the background. One night, after I went to bed, I woke to find the light on in the study. He was copying papers into a folder, tax records and phone bills, sliding them into neat stacks. When I asked the next morning what he had been doing, he simply said he was catching up on work, and I let it go because it seemed boring. I didn't understand that he was already collecting evidence, already preparing his own defense in silence. To me, his refusal to shout back or argue meant I had won, and so I kept pushing harder. The final moment of that week came when I spotted him outside a law office downtown. I was driving past on my lunch break, and there he was, walking down the steps with a folder under his arm. He didn't see me, but I saw him, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of unease. Up until then, I had been so sure the story was mine to control that everyone believed my version, but seeing him there made me realize he might not be as broken as I thought. I told myself he was probably handling taxes for a client, some boring accountant work, but deep down I knew that folder had nothing to do with numbers. That night, he came home late, silent as ever, and while the children slept and my mother called me the brave one, I sat in the dark kitchen realizing I had no idea what was inside that folder. The restaurant dinner was supposed to be a chance for us to look like a normal couple again, but I used it as another stage to make Daniel look small. We had joined two other couples at a busy Italian place downtown, the kind with warm lights and too loud conversations. And from the start, I steered the table toward my story. I told everyone how Daniel's boss Marcus had once crossed the line with me and how Daniel did nothing about it. I leaned back in my chair as I spoke, making it sound as if I had been brave to confess, while Daniel just sat there staring at his water glass. One of the wives gasped and asked what Daniel had said when I told him. I smirked and said he said nothing, that he just froze, and the men at the table laughed uncomfortably. Daniel stayed silent, which to me was permission to keep going. I described Marcus as bold and inappropriate, said I had been strong enough to reject him, and then twisted the knife by pointing out that Daniel had never once confronted him. I wanted everyone to think I was the one holding our marriage together, while Daniel was too weak to defend his own wife. The tension at the table grew as the husbands shifted in their seats and the wives gave me sympathetic looks. One of them murmured that no man should allow such disrespect, and I caught the glances aimed at Daniel, pity mixed with judgment. I sipped my wine slowly, enjoying the way the story painted me as a victim and Daniel as a coward. Every time Daniel opened his mouth, I interrupted and turned it back into proof of his failure. If he said it was complicated because Marcus was his boss, I spun it into him, caring more about his job than me. If he said he had handled it privately, I laughed and claimed he had done nothing at all. He let me do it. He let me turn him into the quiet shadow at the table, and that silence gave me power. After dinner, my friend pulled me aside near the coat rack and whispered that she admired my courage for telling the truth. She said I was strong for standing up for myself when Daniel wouldn't, and I felt vindicated. I told her Daniel was too passive, that I had to fight for myself because he never would. All the while, Daniel stood by the door, waiting quietly, his jaw tight but his words sealed shut. When we got home, the children were asleep at my mother's, and I felt free to lecture him. I told him that he had embarrassed me by not defending me in front of our friends, that he had made me look like a woman married to a man with no backbone. He said nothing, and I stormed off to bed convinced that he was sulking because he knew I was right. What I didn't realize was that his silence was no longer surrender but strategy. The next morning, he left early without a word, and I told myself he was hiding at work. Later that week, I overheard one of my coworkers gossiping that Daniel had been seen leaving a lawyer's office again. I laughed it off in front of her, claiming he was helping with someone's taxes, but inside, I felt a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain. That night at dinner with my mother and the kids, I repeated the restaurant story again, milking their sympathy, but in the corner of my eye, I saw Daniel watching me, with a look I couldn't read. When he excused himself early from the table and walked out of the restaurant without a word, leaving me with friends whispering and staring, I realized for the first time that maybe his silence was not weakness at all, but the beginning of something I could not control. By the time whispers started at Daniel's office, I thought I still had control of the story, but that was when the cracks began to show. Marcus denied everything, of course, saying I had twisted a casual interaction into something dramatic. When the rumor reached me that Daniel had asked Marcus about it directly, and Marcus laughed it off, I spun the tale my way. I told people Marcus was powerful, that Daniel and he were conspiring to silence me, that I was the one standing against two men at once. At home in the evenings, Daniel asked careful questions, never raising his voice. He asked why I was so sure Marcus wanted me, whether I had proof, whether I was telling the whole truth. I answered by accusing him of being paranoid, telling him that his lack of trust was the real betrayal. I claimed I had done nothing wrong except confess, that he was punishing me for honesty. Whenever he pressed, I shifted the focus back on him, saying that if I felt ignored, it was his fault for neglecting me. In my head, it all made sense. Marcus noticed me because Daniel didn't. Marcus made me feel wanted, while Daniel acted like a roommate. So even if the lines blurred between attention and temptation, I convinced myself that I was the wronged one. I whispered to my mother that Daniel had grown suspicious, that he had started checking up on me. And she told me to stand firm, that men often lash out when they know they have failed. That reassurance gave me fuel, and I repeated it at every chance, building the narrative of a husband who was jealous and small-minded. The children could feel the storm, though. One night, Ethan wandered into the kitchen while we argued. He asked me quietly why Daddy was sleeping in the office. I told him that his father was upset because he did not know how to be brave. Ethan looked confused, but I planted the seed. Clara toddled around asking if Daddy was angry, and I answered that he was not angry, just afraid. I wanted them to see me as the strong one. Looking back, I realize how cruel it was, but in the moment, I believed it was survival. Daniel's behavior grew quieter but sharper. I began to notice the way he checked the mail before I could. He started keeping his briefcase locked. I found him in the study late at night, scanning old bank statements into neat folders. When I asked, he said he was reorganizing files. I told myself it was work, but I felt a flicker of unease when I saw how methodical he was. One Saturday, while I was folding laundry, I watched him photograph receipts on his phone. When I teased him about being obsessive, he only gave me a tight smile. That smile unsettled me more than any shouting match could have. Gossip at my workplace worsened matters. A colleague mentioned that Marcus had been openly dismissing my claims, telling others that I was unstable, and the sting of hearing that only made me double down. I told anyone who would listen that Marcus was lying to protect himself and Daniel was covering for him. I claimed they were both trying to paint me as a liar. I needed sympathy, and I got it from some, but others began to look doubtful. My sister suggested I let the matter drop, but I accused her of siding with Daniel. I said everyone was blind to how much I had suffered. The most humiliating moment came when I overheard Daniel speaking quietly on the phone in the garage. He was calm, collected, using words like custody, financial separation, and evidence. I froze in the doorway, realizing for the first time that he was not just sulking, but building something concrete against me. I confronted him, saying he was planning betrayal, but he stayed calm, asked why I was so afraid if I had nothing to hide. I accused him of trying to break me, of twisting everything I had said, but he only went back to his folder and wrote something down. That night, Ethan asked if he could sleep in the study with his father because he hated hearing us argue. I said no, but when I went upstairs, I found the door already shut and the light still on. I lay awake in our bed alone, telling myself Daniel was weak and would never follow through. Yet, in the silence of the house, I could feel the weight of those folders growing heavier. The next morning, Daniel carried a stack of papers to his car before sunrise, and as I watched him drive away, a sudden fear gripped me that whatever he was preparing was no longer just theory, but the beginning of an end I had never imagined. The family gathering was supposed to be light-hearted, a birthday party for my niece with balloons tied to chairs and children running in the yard, but I used it as another chance to prove I was the one wronged. Surrounded by relatives, I launched into the story again about Marcos and how Daniel had done nothing to protect me. I made sure everyone could hear, my voice rising above the clatter of plates and laughter. I said I had been brave enough to admit what happened, while Daniel sat silent, and that silence meant guilt. Some of my cousins exchanged glances, but my mother Linda put a hand on my shoulder and told me I was strong for speaking up. That was the support I wanted. I pressed on, saying a husband who truly loved his wife would have confronted the man who disrespected her. Daniel sat 2 chairs down, his expression blank, not offering me any ground to argue with. Tom, his brother, finally spoke. He said my words were unfair, that Daniel did not deserve to be attacked in front of family. I brushed him off and said Daniel was welcome to speak if he disagreed, but since he said nothing, it only proved my point. That stung Tom, and his wife frowned at me, but I leaned into Linda's reassurance, framing myself as the wife left alone in the battle. The children heard pieces of it too. Ethan tugged on my sleeve and asked if Daddy was in trouble, and I told him that Daddy just did not know how to be brave. The words rolled easily off my tongue, even though I saw Daniel flinch slightly when I said them. The mood at the party shifted, conversations quieted around us, people whispering in corners while I pretended not to notice. I thought I was winning because I had the loudest voice, but I also saw the way some relatives avoided my eyes. Daniel remained still, which frustrated me more than if he had yelled. I told myself his silence was weakness, but underneath my chest tightened because it also felt like planning. That evening, back at the house, I kept replaying how Tom had looked at me like I was the one destroying things. I paced the kitchen while Linda told me to stand firm, saying men always try to turn things around when they are guilty. I believed her, and that belief gave me enough courage to keep attacking. Daniel went upstairs without a word. An hour later, when I came into our room, he was waiting with an envelope on the nightstand. He said nothing, simply placed it there and turned away. I opened it after he left. Inside was a notice from a law firm confirming a consultation. My throat went dry. I told myself it was nothing, probably routine for his work, but the letter had his name listed as a client. My mind spun, yet I refused to let fear show. When Linda called that night, I told her Daniel was being dramatic and trying to scare me. She told me not to let him win, that he was bluffing. I repeated that to myself as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, though the paper felt heavy in my hands. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen, calmly making breakfast for the children as if nothing had changed, and the quiet confidence in his movements scared me more than any fight ever had, because I realized he no longer needed to argue. He already had a plan. The first real shift came when I opened my purse at the grocery store, and my card was declined. At first I thought it was a mistake, maybe a bank error, so I tried another card. Declined again. The cashier gave me a pitying look while I fumbled, and I felt heat rise to my face. I walked out, leaving half the groceries behind, furious but also shaken. When I got home, Daniel was in the study, calmly sorting papers into folders. I demanded to know if he had done something with our accounts, but he only said I should check my statements. My hands trembled as I logged in on my phone, and the truth hit me. He had frozen access. Every joint card I used was disabled. Only his remained untouched. For the first time since this began, I realized his silence had been cover for something deliberate. I called my mother immediately, crying that Daniel was punishing me for speaking the truth. She told me he was cruel and I had every right to be angry. She offered to lend me money, which I accepted, but inside I felt a new kind of fear. If he had already taken steps with our finances, what else had he been planning? That question was answered 2 days later when an envelope arrived by courier. It was a letter from his lawyer, formally notifying me of financial separation proceedings. My stomach twisted as I read words like asset protection and custody arrangements. He had not threatened or yelled. He had gone straight to the law. I confronted him in the kitchen that evening, demanding to know why he was tearing our family apart. He looked at me with a calmness that unnerved me and asked why I was so afraid if I had nothing to hide. I lashed out, accusing him of betrayal, saying I had only ever confessed out of honesty. I told him he was trying to make me the villain when I had been the one hurt. He didn't argue. He only said the children would be safe and then turned back to preparing their lunches for school. The coldness in his control was unbearable. I tried to spin the story to friends, saying Daniel had become paranoid and controlling, that he was starving me of resources to punish me. A few sympathized, but more than one asked quietly if there was something I wasn't telling them. I felt the ground shift under me. Even my sister, who usually sided with me, told me to be careful, that legal action meant he had evidence. I brushed her off, claiming Daniel was bluffing, but I knew she was right. The children sensed it too. Ethan asked why we couldn't go for ice cream like usual, and I had to admit my card wasn't working. He asked if Daddy would pay instead, and I snapped that Daddy cared more about money than family. But the look on Ethan's face told me I had said too much. Clara clung to Daniel's leg that night as if she understood he was the steady one. I felt myself slipping further from control, yet I kept grasping for excuses. When Tom visited, Daniel handed him a folder right in front of me. I demanded to know what was inside, but Tom only shook his head. Later that evening, I overheard them in hushed conversation about dates, documentation, and custody schedules. I stormed into the room, accusing them of plotting against me, but Daniel calmly said it was all for the best. I screamed that he was destroying the family, but the words sounded hollow even to me. By the end of that week, I realized he had outmaneuvered me completely. While I had been busy telling stories to friends and family, painting him as weak, he had been building a quiet wall of evidence. Bank statements, receipts, copies of messages, all stacked against me. And now, with my accounts frozen and a lawyer's letter in hand, I understood that this wasn't just a bluff. It was the beginning of my own undoing. The morning of the court summons, I watched Daniel leave the house in his usual calm suit and tie, carrying the same folder he had been building for weeks. And I finally understood that my voice and my stories no longer mattered, because the law was about to speak for him. The courthouse felt colder than I expected, not just in the air, but in the way people looked at me. I walked in clutching my bag, hoping my mother's reassurances were right, that Daniel had nothing real, that this was all just a scare tactic. But when the judge began reading through the documents his lawyer had submitted, my heart sank. There were receipts showing nights I had claimed to be with friends, but had in fact been with Marcus. There were text records that looked innocent out of context, but taken together, told a clear story of secret meetings and lies. There were even statements from neighbors who had seen Marcus's car near our house when Daniel was away. Each piece was small on its own, but Daniel had arranged them into a puzzle that fit too perfectly. I tried to defend myself, saying Daniel was twisting things, that I had only ever wanted honesty in our marriage, but my voice sounded thin against the calm authority of his lawyer. The judge looked at me with a measured expression, not cruel, just unimpressed. Daniel never raised his voice, never gloated. He sat with his hands folded, nodding occasionally, as if he had already accepted the outcome before walking into the room. I kept waiting for him to break, to show anger, to reveal weakness, but he stayed composed, and that composure made me feel small. The children were not there, but their names came up again and again. Custody schedules, visitation rights, financial support, all laid out like business transactions. I tried to argue that I was the more nurturing parent, that Daniel was cold and detached, but the judge pointed to the stability of his planning, the way he had shielded them from conflict while I dragged them into my complaints. Hearing my own behavior described in those terms was like a mirror I wanted to shatter. My mother wept softly beside me, but even her presence felt powerless against the weight of the evidence. When the ruling came, it was swift. Temporary custody rights granted to Daniel, financial accounts placed under his control until further review, and supervised visitation for me until the matter was settled long-term. The words struck like stones. I opened my mouth to object, but the judge moved on, addressing the next case as if my entire life had not just been dismantled. Daniel stood, thanked the court, and walked out without looking back. I followed slowly, feeling eyes on me, whispers curling in the air. Outside on the courthouse steps, Tom stood waiting, arms crossed, and when he saw me, his expression was not anger, but something worse, disappointment. My mother clung to me, insisting it wasn't fair, but I knew no one believed me anymore. I had spent months painting Daniel as the weak one, the coward, the man who wouldn't defend me, and now I was the one standing defenseless in the open while he walked away with everything intact. As Daniel disappeared into the crowd with his folder tucked neatly under his arm, I stood frozen on the courthouse steps, realizing the story I had built so carefully had collapsed in one morning, and there was no one left willing to carry it for me. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching.